Tonight we want to begin with the clang of swords or the crash of longships against the shore. Instead, we step into a Viking longhouse before the world outside remembers its own noise. Here the air is thick with the warmth of sleeping embers and the faint salt of last night's firewood. Shadows lean against the timber-bird walls where stories were traded in low voices, the kind that carried secrets without ever raising themselves above the crackle of flame. In this half-light, power was quieter than you might expect. It moved not with kings or raiders, but with the one who stirred the morning pot, who knew which jar held the honey and which man needed a softened word before battle. Behind these walls, loyalty and ambition tangled in the same smoke that curled toward the rafters, wrapping itself around beams that had listened for generations. So lower the lights. Let the longhouse stretch around you like the hull of a ship drifting on still water. And if your breathing begins to fall in step with the slow turning of the hearth's fire, perhaps the next campfire will be waiting for you there. And as the night folds itself around that distant fire, we will follow its faint glow toward the first story waiting in the dark. It will begin not with trumpets or proclamations, but with a single thread of breath, one that winds through corridors of stone, pages of law, or the low rafters of a longhouse, until it finds the voices, the secrets, and the silences history tried to leave behind. Before the warriors spoke or the day decided on its mood, the first sounds in the longhouse belonged to the hearth, the soft coaxing of embers, the scrape of a ladle circling barley porridge, the creak of the well bucket answering the same pull as yesterday. The air held the weight of tarred rope, wool, and bread slowly remembering to rise. Tasks unfolded like a tide mashing grain for ale, carding fleece, carrying coals for the smithy, while stories about seals and storms kept children still long enough to listen. Benches leaned against the walls like old companions. Fish strips turned patient under the rafters. A cradle swung itself into rhythm beneath the roof beam. In this half-light, the concubine's world was deliberate and precise servant and steward, companion and strategist, knowing which jar held salt, which man needed warmth in his voice, which hour asked for silence. Beyond these chores lived the longhouse's second heartbeat, the one that ticked in quiet corners when the doorcloth settled and voices lowered. Pillow talk is not an anachronism. It is only linen with a northern accent. Some concubines were confidants to men who sailed the law as boldly as they sailed the sea, and a soft observation could tip the day's plan toward this ally or that. A whispered caution about a brother-in-law with a temper could rearrange the bench at a feast, which is no small diplomacy where benches are alliances wearing blankets. A reminder that winter grain stores look generous in summer but shy in. March might delay a raid by a week and make a village rounder with relief. Gifts moved along these channels too. A silver brooch that said so much with so little weight, a bright bead from a market 2 rivers away, a knife with a carved handle that meant memory. What was given could be read, and many women learned to read men the way others read runes. They learned the pulse of the thing, when a boast meant courage and when it meant fear, when the right answer was yes and when the better answer was finish your ale and sleep. Even the longhouse posts learned to keep secrets. Smoke dimmed their carvings and made them look older than anyone, which is an excellent qualification for silence. The politics of a settlement often ran on the quiet fuel of a word chosen in the dark, the gentle veto of a hand on a sleeve, the comic rescue of a badly told story retold well enough to rescue its teller. The second scene opens where the morning has finished wiping its hands and the day has taken a position. Households make their own weather, but the law decides where the shadows fall. A wife had legal heft, marriage, arranged property, inheritance, dowry, the location of the big chest with the good keys. She sat nearest the high seat at feasts and kept the ring of house keys jingling like a small iron declaration. A concubine, by contrast, navigated a channel uncharted by law and mapped instead by custom and skill. She could be cherished, protected, even influential. She could also be dismissed, traded, or quietly dissolved into a new household if politics changed its shirt. Rivalries rose not like storms, but like fogs, curls of suspicion around the edges of everyday chores. The lawful wife measured respect by how often her counsel was asked in public and how still the room became when she began a sentence. The concubine measured hers by the errands delivered through her hands, the gifts that remembered her favorites, and the way a man changed the angle of his shoulders when she entered the room. Each had duties, each had claims, each learned to use a pause as a tool. If you've ever watched two cats agree whose chair it is without a single claw, you have seen the seminar. Some houses managed this balance like jugglers. Others dropped plates and called it fate. In all this, children stood like small planets and pulled tides. The wife's sons inherited farms and ships. The concubine's sons might inherit boats of their own, or might inherit only good training and a wish. Many did well foster to uncles, married into steadings that respected their steadiness, gifted a stake in a venture where their seamanship did the talking. Others did not, and their names slid out of the sagas like a boat into morning fog. Love, being Nordic when necessary and human the rest of the time, wrote its poems anyway. Forbidden's romances did not always end at the edge of a law. Sometimes they began there, and glances carried like discreet parcels. A drapa might praise a warrior's sword with metaphors so shiny you need a shade for them, while a lascivissa, a quick verse, could slide between two people at a feast and become a thread they tugged for months. Skalds composed with kennings, those stacked metaphors that turn a ship into a sea steed and a woman into a bride of treasure, which is awkward as an introduction and flattering as a poem. A concubine can inspire verse, accept its praise without endorsing its plans, and use the whole display to bargain for linen or leniency. Runes were careful guests at this party, carved discreetly on a comb, scratched into the underside of a bench, or inked onto wood with a sentence that pretended to be about the weather. They ferried news and promises. Sometimes the news broke a law. Sometimes the law broke a heart, and the poem kept the peace that was still beating. Jealousy did not throw dishes every night. More often, it reorganized chores. A woman who sensed a rival might claim the brewing, which is a labor and a small throne, or take over the weaving of sailcloth, because ships deserve loyalty, and so do the women who mend them. Men, not eager to name their own jealousy, offered bracelets and swore oaths and practiced looking as though that had been the plan all along. Everyone understood that embarrassment is the ninth cardinal sin, and most therefore sinned very quietly. The third scene launches when oars hit water and duty takes a larger shape. Not every concubine entered the longhouse by choice or by local courting. Raids brought wealth and people in the same sweep of rain. And some of those people were women who learned a new language by listening from a corner and learned a new household by watching whom never changed the way he spoke to a dog. Captives can become kin in 2 or 3 generations if a community wants them to. They can also remain ghosts with names. The road from terror to tenderness is long and rarely straight. A woman taken from a Pictish farm might arrive in a fjord like a piece of weather, neither welcomed nor refused. Simply present, unavoidable. She learned to fold herself into work, fish to split and dry barley to grind on a quern, whose hum becomes a sort of thinking cloth to weave on a warp-weighted loom, whose stones remember beaches she has not seen. She kept a little of her language like a secret bead and smuggled it into lullabies, where no one minds what anything means as long as the rhythm walks. In time she might be companion rather than captive, a woman whose opinion about a neighbor's boast could sharpen a man's day toward wisdom. Or she might find only a different silence and join the line of people who did their work perfectly and slipped through memory with clean hands. History is honest when it admits that both are true and the choice was rarely hers. And yet wealth and choice sometimes followed. A clever woman turned gifts into leverage, the way ships turn wind into destination. A string of glass beads from the east became a token handed to a merchant who remembered her favor at the next fair. A little silver, bartered from private savings, bought a small share in a cow, and therefore in a calf, and therefore in next winter as milk that a house might discover it needed badly. A smile in the right room purchased a seat at the wrong moment and prevented a quarrel from inventing a feud. Some concubines bore children to chieftains and watched those children grow into people for whom the law made new shelves. A son might be acknowledged formally and given a farm with stone corners. A daughter might be married to a craftsman with hands that turned bone into combs and antler into chessmen that kept the family's stories on a board. Freedom could appear as a gift deed, a marriage contract with tidy lines, or as the simple fact that no one any longer remembered to call her anything except by her name. Others negotiated their way back toward their homelands in trade caravans that behaved like moving towns. Or they found a place in monasteries' guest houses when the new century began whispering a different sacred grammar along the coasts. Strength has many uniforms. Some of them look like patience. In the fourth and drowsiest scene, memory becomes theater, and theater becomes memory again. The sagas do not file concubines under one heading. They appear as temptresses because temptation flatters the fallen. They appear as spies because intrigue flatters a plot. They appear as loyal companions because loyalty flatters the dead. They appear as clever disasters because disasters flatter a good storyteller. A skald, needing a hinge for a tale, borrowed a woman's glance and made it an omen. Another, needing a joke, brewed one at a woman's expense, and then apologized by letting her win the argument. These are not documentary witnesses. They are midnight company for people who know hard winters. Yet, even in exaggeration, the sagas preserve small truths like dried berries and cake. Love is a currency with poor exchange rates. Jealousy is a tax collected in silence. Work is the background music. A concubine-esque toolkit remains visible in the lines. She brews a batch of ale that repairs a day. She seat shuffles quarrelers with the skill of a chess player. She hides a knife not because she plans to use it, but because a knife is a way to own a corner of the world. Archaeology, imperturbable as a boulder, nods along. Graves yield brooches whose pin catch has worn smooth with use. Spindle whirls that turn the absent weight of wool into a memory you can hold. Beads threaded for journeys that either happened or were hoped for. Longhouses surrender the blackened soil of hearths and the ghost lines of benches, leaving us to imagine which spot was a throne, and which spot was a place to be only oneself. In waste pits, the seeds of barley and the bones of fish argue gently about diet, and combed teeth carved from antlers smile the same patient smile they smiled in life. A stick carved with a few ruined surfaces and says something like "Sigurd owns me," which is as complete a poem as anyone needs. The smaller objects whisper most clearly: a child's toy boat from a scrap of wood, a needle case made from a bird bone, an amber bead bored not quite straight through because the day had other interruptions. When these things are placed in cases under glass, the room changes temperature. You can almost hear the corn's steady song and the way a woman's voice rides over it with a story that contains absolutely no dragons because dragons might keep a child awake. Legends leak into later centuries like dye through wool. Ballads remember mistresses in velvet who never wore velvet, and novels assign everybody neat motives because neatness is a comfortable chair. Television discovers that longhouses are particularly good at torchlight, and then everything becomes torchlight even at noon. Meanwhile, folk customs keep quieter echoes. A wedding toast includes a phrase that used to be about ships. A recipe for barley loaf insists on stirring in a particular direction because a grandmother said so, and it turns out she was echoing a superstition 500 winters old. Scholars comb law codes and find clauses that treat concubines as problems to be managed. Then come sagas and find stories that treat them as people to be listened to, and the truth sits politely between the two, warming its hands at the hearth. Museums write labels. Children press noses to glass. Somewhere a modern weaver repeats a warp-weighted technique and discovers that her shoulders understand it before her head does. If you are drifting now, the Longhouse approves. The roof beams were always a little smoky, and even the warriors slept. So the day of a Viking concubine becomes an arch of quiet competence. Morning belongs to fire, water, fiber, and food. That obliges by turning hot at the right moment. Noon belongs to negotiation, the unglamorous arithmetic of honor and appetite. Evening belongs to verses in which metaphors ride around like ponies, and to conversations that push a plan one notch toward prudence. Night belongs to a bedboard shared with someone who believes he commanded the day and may yet be convinced that he did. It is not a heroic rhythm, but it is exactly the tempo that keeps ships repaired, fields planted, feasts civil, and tempers explained to themselves. You could say there was no plot. You could say that the Longhouse ran on small, repeatable miracles. A spoon that remembers to hang on the pot's rim. A key that turns without announcing itself. A word placed where it will do the most good with the least noise. I could keep speaking about warp weights that look like river pebbles with holes about horn cups, that throw back the firelight with a friendliness glass never matches about a wedding band hammered from a melted coin that still smells faintly of trade winds. But the hearth's last ember has rolled into the nest of ashes, and the roof has settled into the night's sentence. The Longhouse knows how to keep watch. Let the last sound be the soft breathing of a room that has nothing left to prove. You might not expect a civilization famous for axes to be obsessed with tiny teeth, but the Vikings carried combs as faithfully as they carried blades. Archaeologists keep finding them in graves like polite signatures, little rectangles of antler or bone stitched with iron rivets, their edges bristling with lines so narrow you could almost hear them count. A whole morning could begin with that quiet arithmetic. A comb comes out of a pouch tied to a belt. A beard that slept like a thicket agrees to become a meadow. Hair that kept its opinions under a wool cap admits the possibility of order. The comb's teeth walk through oil and wind and yesterday's campfire until the day looks smoother. Someone dips the comb in a bowl of water with a pinch of ashes to persuade the grease to behave. A louse, having chosen the wrong career, meets the fine side and becomes a footnote. If you are still awake by the time I explain why the best combs have a small loop so they can hang in the steam of a bathhouse and soften into good manners, feel free to subscribe with the energy it takes to slide a thumb along a warm antler edge, or simply let the thought fall back like hair onto a pillow. I'll never know. The Longhouse will keep breathing, and the comb will keep counting. Behind the neatness sits a whole workshop disguised as a pocket object. A comb begins years earlier in a forest as antlers choose to be shed. Reindeer in the north and red deer farther south leave them on moss as if forgetting hats at a feast. Hunters collect them in spring the way children collect interesting sticks, only with more purpose and fewer interruptions. The antler is sawed into slabs whose smell sits somewhere between wood and winter. A craftsman scores lines with a knife that remembers every thumb that ever studied it. He separates the backplate from the tooth plates, carves shoulder pieces shaped like little shields, and drills holes for rivets with a bow drill that hums like a patient insect. Teeth are cut one by one in a rhythm that makes neighbors calmer. The wide teeth for beard and wool, the fine teeth for diligence. If the workshop has a good day, the teeth stand like a line of obedient geese. If the knife is sulking, a tooth leans a little and is invited to try again on the next comb. Iron rivets clamp the whole creature together, dots of darkness across pale bone like a very polite constellation. The maker sometimes adds lines, circles, or knotwork. Not because a comb needs decoration to function, but because hands prefer beauty if given the option. When you hold such a comb, you hold a list. Forest, animal, season, tool, person, hour. Daily life makes a small theater around grooming. Mornings in the longhouse drift through smoke and porridge, and there's always the moment when someone braids. Hair wants to become rope, rope wants to become plan. A woman divides strands as if she were splitting threads on a loom, lost in the particular concentration that resembles prayer even when it isn't. Man plats his mustache out of the way before a meal. A child practices the crisp gesture of pulling a comb through with just enough firmness to earn praise, but not tears. A bowl serves as a mirror if held at the right angle. Polished bronze serves better if you are lucky. Beard oil might be no more than goose fat and herbs. The smell sits between kitchen and meadow and offends no one except, perhaps, the dog who considers it rival information. A fine-toothed comb becomes a kind of currency in conversation. You can borrow one and return it with gratitude. You can show a stranger you mean no harm by taking out your comb instead of your knife. You can hint at romance by gifting a comb with a little carving of a ship that looks like it is sailing somewhere specific and private. Some afternoons turn the comb from utensil to instrument. The bathhouse, when the settlement is lucky enough to have one, steams like a deliberate cloud. Water sings against hot stones. Birch switches make the air remember forests. Laughter edits the day. Here the comb does social work. Lice that ancient democracy are discouraged in public. Friends take turns checking each other's hair with the brisk tenderness of people who live in close quarters and prefer comfort to embarrassment. Somewhere a skald smooths his beard before reciting, because a poem behaves better if the poet looks like someone who can be trusted with syllables. A trader visiting from far off pulls out a comb of walrus ivory that glows the way stale moonlight might glow if it decided to be useful. It says more about his roots than his words do. Children float little pieces of cut hair on a rinsing trough as if launching ships. The heat thins the distance between strangers. Clean hair squeaks under the comb like snow under a sled. No one needs a hero saga here. A bucket and a bench make better bedtime literature. The comb is a messenger in markets as well. At Kalpang, at Burka, at Hidibi, stalls rattle with antler offcuts and blanks shaped for tea, shoulder plates half-carved, rivet strips coiled like a polite snake. A maker lays out his wares in lines as straight as he can manage. Customers test the teeth against their thumb pads and smile when the spacing is true. Prices move like wind. A comb with clean decoration costs a little more than the same comb without. A comb with a fitted case stitched of leather asks for a handful of beads or the promise of a favor later. Someone gambles today's profit on slab-back styles from the East because travelers nodded approvingly at them last month. The fine teeth, always a little fragile, break if a stall shade is too cold. A maker warms his pieces under his cloak as if they were small birds. Rivets betray quality. Iron loves to rust. A good comb resists by virtue of fit, and an excellent comb adds bronze where iron would sulk. If a storm threatens, the stall-keeper covers everything with a sailcloth that was once part of an actual ship, and the whole market becomes a flotilla at anchor, the combs inside like cargo ready for launch. Of course, vanity launches legends on its own. A neat beard can mislead a council as surely as a long ship can mislead a coastline. Men who plundered silver still prefer to look respectable when dividing it, as though tidy hair could persuade luck to return. Women who negotiated marriages braided with deliberation, because a well-ordered head looks like a well-ordered household. A concubine, if we wander back to last week's longhouse, could shift an argument, as moved by the angle of a braid that said, "Today we are patient," or "Today we are iron." The comb becomes a soft gavel. Outsiders notice. Analysts from elsewhere remark, often with surprise, that these northerners are clean and care about presentation. It does not fit the script, which is precisely why it should be read carefully aloud. Even weapons listen to grooming. A sword belt sits better on a tunic that lies clean. A helmet accepts hair coiled out of the way. A shield after a battle ends the day propped against a bench, while its owner leans back, combs steadily, and lets his hands tell his body that it has a future. Second scene now, and we move from use to manufacture without telling the transition out loud. Workshops of bone and antler have their own weather. The floor is confetti of shavings that remember deer more than they remember knives. Sunlight folds itself into the small room and becomes sawdust. A seat worn by one pair of hips knows exactly where the left-hand tools prefer to live. The maker's bow drill, wrapped with cord that has been replaced with family thrift 3 times this season, turns between palm pads and sings the note that tells a child to stop running. Water sits in a dish to wet a whetstone. The stone surface darkens wherever a blade's impatience tried to be precision. There are jigs, a small angled board that holds slats while their teeth are cut, a punch template for rivet spacing, a pattern comb with mysterious marks that outsiders mistake for decoration and that insiders know is a private arithmetic. The workday is measured in rows of teeth. Each hour, a slat becomes a promise you can hold. Trade brings tasks the workshop enjoys. Someone orders combs with rounder shoulders because the latest fashion is kind to pockets. Someone else orders extra wide teeth for fleece teased from whole sheets of snow. A third wants traveling sets, comb and ear scoop and pick stitched into a leather sleeve that hangs from a belt like a small tool roll. A good maker sells repair as confidently as he sells new work. Teeth break, rivets loosen. A comb that rode in a belt while its owner climbed a wet hill needs to be reseated with new plates. The repair bench holds the stories of strangers. Here's an ivory comb from a ship that smelled of Arabic spice. Here's a plain bone comb that belongs to a farmer who tells jokes about worms. Here's a comb with a runic inscription that says nothing and means everything. Solvik owns me. Makers read these lines with soft pride. Their work cross-hatches the map. There is also the matter of pests, which, as mentioned earlier, prefer democracy. Lice were common, but resignation was not the only response. Fine teeth caught eggs. Steam finished the lecture. Kerosene does not exist yet, but the North knows resin and smoke. A comb dipped in broth scented with juniper or wormwood works with stubborn, helpful optimism. Households boiled combs as they boiled spoons. Children made games of inspection combing as counting as victory. If a stranger arrived unkempt, hospitality included a basin and bench near the fire, the same way modern hospitality includes a charger offered without judgment. Cleanliness is a social treaty signed one strand at a time. The third scene lengthens toward evening and memory. A comb goes on journeys across hills, across seas, across lifetimes. Many are buried with their owners, not because the afterlife is untidy, but because the comb was as personal as a voice. In graves, combs lie near the head, often in small wood or leather cases like sleeping boxes. Time collapses around them. Teeth shatter, rivets sulk, yet pattern survives, double-sided rivet rows. Shoulder plates that once held tiny animals or dots arranged like the night over winter water. The excavation notebook reads, comb, antler, type B, fine and coarse, 23 rivets, which is austere language for something that spent years on a person's body. Museums line them up, and the room purrs with the effort of not touching. You discover that every comb, even the plain ones, expects to be held the right way. Thumb on the warm back plate, fingers curling under, wrists relaxed. There is a pedagogy in tools. They teach hands how to be hands. Texts notice. Laws occasionally pause in their business of wool and homicide to mention combs, often in fines. Break a man's comb in a brawl, pay accordingly. Charms mention them, 2 little verses meant to help hair grow, to help relationships settle, to help a day remember it can still be salvaged after breakfast fought with a loaf. Runes on combs are short because combs are small, but we have enough to feel the mischief. Think of me, carved as if shyness had a knife. Thor blessed this beard, carved as if thunder did salon visits. In some places, combs become amulets against shape-shifting. In others, they are merely what they appear to be, civilization pocket-sized. Markets change, and with them, combs. The slab-backed fashion gives way to frames with separate tooth sets. Bronze rivets give way to iron when trade sulks. Decoration grows stormy and then gentle again, as craftsmen learn new ways to enjoy the same rectangle. Monasteries arrive with their own grooming habits and their own silence. Some settle gladly into the cycle of washing and combing that looks like prayer from a distance. The north becomes cross-stitched with roots of amber and glass and good ideas. A comb from the east whispers that whalebone likes different teeth. A comb from the islands laughs in choral. The object adapts with the patience of a creature that intends to outlast whims. Night finally tucks itself around the settlement, and the fourth scene softens. The comb returns to its pouch, its case, its shelf above the bedboard where it shares space with a knife that can peel bark quietly. Lamps burn fish oil, conversations slope downward. A mother combs a child's hair until the child's eyelids agree to the treaty. A woman puts a comb beside a small mirror and hopes that both will witness better news tomorrow. A man smooths his beard after the last spoon of stew as if polishing the story of his day. One person carves a new comb in the doorway because sleep takes time to arrive when the sea kept you awake with plans. The blade scrapes rhythm and the neighborhood accepts it. Someone else mends a tooth with a sliver and a sigh. Dogs, who do not use combs, nevertheless approve of the atmosphere they create. If you gather these little motions, the morning arithmetic of teeth and hair, the bathhouse diplomacy, the workshop's geometry, the market's gossip, the grave's patient inventory, you find that a Viking comb is quietly immodest. It insists that small order is a kind of courage. An army of tiny teeth walks through a day and leaves it smoother than it was. That is not a saga, but it is a life. You can trace the route from forest to antler to slab to tooth to rivet to hand to hair, and back again, a loop that feels like a lullaby when you say it slowly. The comb's best trick may be the way it asks for exactly as much attention as you have left at the end of an hour, no more. If you drift now, you will drift cleanly. Still, I can keep murmuring about shoulder plates that compare to ship prows, about the way oil softens antler like a kind word softens an argument, about the single missing rivet that embarrasses a cone, the way a missing button embarrasses a shirt, about the ring case stitched with 2 colors of thread because the maker had time, about the workshop sweepings that, when burned, smell faintly of winter sky. But the last of the lamplight is practicing its own combing across the rafters, and the longhouse has begun its careful, even snore. The small rectangle of antler waits by your hand like a friendly bookmark. Tomorrow, it will count again. Tonight, it is enough to know how quietly the teeth align. You might not expect the most dangerous thing on a Viking ship to be fabric, but the sail can throw mood across 50 men with one sulk of its hem. It begins far from the sea, of course, the way sea things like to begin on land. A sheep stands chewing the opinion of grass, storing sunlight in its fleece like a quiet battery. Hands that have known winter stroke along its back and imagine a square the size of a room. Clipping day comes with calm voices and the smell of lanolin, that gentle grease which makes fingers look as if they remember youth. The fleece leaves the sheep in a single cloud and becomes a series of plans. On a clean day, it is washed in stream water that has no idea what a ship is. Teased with combs until it forgets the notion of clumps, spun into yarn on spindles that turn like polite planets. The spindle whirl, heavy and content, pulls the twist down the fibers of they agree to be string. A woman sitting by the doorway feeds the twist with a patience that can be heard from the road. If you re still awake when I explain why the best spinners keep 2 baskets, one for yarn that will drink dye like a thirsty poet, and one for yarn that prefers its natural shade, Feel free to subscribe in the drowsy way a spindle nods when the yarn reaches the floor. Or do nothing. The sail is not keeping attendance. It is only breathing in very slowly. The loom carries a sail like a house carries a roof. The warp-weighted kind stands against a wall with its uprights like two thoughtful trees. Warp threads hang from a beam and swing slightly when someone walks by, as if the whole pattern had a pulse. At the bottom, loom weights of baked clay or stone tug the threads into order. Each weight remembers a beach from which it was picked, and when the weaver ties it on, she brings a little coastline into the fabric without telling anyone. Weft threads, thrown with a shuttle that behaves like a well-educated bird, pass over and under in long, consistent breath. The cloth grows downward like an icicle that has decided to be warm. Two weavers often stand side by side to make widths that will later be stitched into the great square. Their voices travel without breaking. The room smells of wool and tea and the confidence that accumulates after the 200th repetition. The pattern is simple because ambition is for smaller things. Strength is what sails need. Weft beating is done not with anger, but with the polite insistence of someone tapping a friend's shoulder until a story gets told properly. When a child is allowed to throw the shuttle once, the whole house receives it as an omen of good weather. These are the beginnings of wind. Now comes fulling, which is the way cloth becomes serious. Wool fibers carry tiny scales, like arguments on a micro scale, and if you wet them with warm water and soap and ask them to rub shoulders for an afternoon, they lock together like neighbors who have finally agreed on the fence. Soap is not yet a bar with a proud perfume. It is more likely lye from ashes or the time-honored, nose-honored use of stale urine collected in a bucket with a lid and optimism. The cloth is trampled, worked, coaxed, sung to. It thickens. It becomes the sort of fabric that can remember a wind from last year. Some places beat it with wooden hammers. Some use the soft and stubborn method of feet. When it has drunk enough labor, it is rinsed until the day smells of relief. Then it is stretched on a tenter frame and left to tighten under pegs called tenter hooks. That phrase still lingers when people feel suspense, though the wool itself experiences no suspense, only a thoughtful tightening that makes edges honest. Dye may come now if a stripe is desired matter for red that looks like an argument from faraway woad, for blue that knows the name of the sky birch, for a yellow that doesn't mind being mistaken for sunshine. Most sails remain in the family of undyed sheep, a patchwork of browns and creams and grays that looks like the weather itself has decided to be woven. Tar enters like a quiet uncle. The sea hates softness, and the sail, for all its layered will, needs armor that flexes. A mixture of sheep tallow and pine tar, thinned with heat and faith, is brushed into the cloth until it drinks no more. You can smell the future in it: smoke, pine, salt, the inside of a toolbox. Tar turns a hand dark and refuses to apologize. The surface becomes slightly shiny, slightly sticky, slightly invincible. Drops of rain will later decide to leave immediately. Wind will catch and be held. The sail grows heavier, but it also grows moral. People who have handled this tarred wool carry the scent for a day or two. Strangers will know what they do for a living without asking. Somewhere, a cat rolls on a scrap and becomes a maritime professional by accident. A ship's yard straight-grained, properly coaxed by a carpenter waits above the hull like an eyebrow. The sail is hauled aboard and laced to the yard with rope made of bass fibers or animal hair, ropes that remember the time they were plants and are pleased to have a second career. Around the edges of the sail run bolt ropes, the strong cords that take the strain directly so the cloth can work on lift instead of suffering on tearing. The corners are reinforced with patches and rings, usually of leather or metal because corners are where enthusiasm is measured. Reef points, those short ties arranged in tidy rows, look like freckles when the yard is lowered and the cloth hangs slack. They will later tame the sail when the wind decides to be interesting. A square sail is a calm thing by nature, but it appreciates being able to become a smaller square and smaller still until it is only a suggestion of itself. The crew hoists the whole apparatus with a unity that is different from prayer, but no less rhythmic. The sail rises, the yard creaks, the mast answers, and the ship decides to be impatient with the shoreline. Out at sea, the fabric is both patient and particular. Wind presses into it as if into a giant hand. The hand closes around the air. The air agrees to be carried. The belly of the sail forms like a yawn and holds there. The helmsman watches the leech, the edges, and steers until the cloth stops complaining in little flutters. Thread counts in the cloth become behavior. A weave too open will shiver and not grip. A weave too tight will sulk and refuse to bow. The best sails are conversationalists. They answer a change of course with a shift of their own shoulders. They giggle slightly in light airs, canvas laughter, and they hum under strong winds with a note so low it persuades men to work in unison. If you ask the sail for more than it can politely give, it tells you by stretching in one corner the way a face tells you with a wince. Then you ease off a little and everybody forgives everybody. The ship tends its cloth like a family member. Morning sees hands on the seams, thumbs pressing along stitches that sat well yesterday, but might have decided to daydream in the night. Wool shrinks and loosens with weather. Tar sets like a mood. The mate adjusts ties, checks for chafe where a rope has thought too hard about friction, and adds small leather rub strips where wood and cloth have begun a disagreement. Needles on board are large, blunt-tipped, and insist on a palm guard. The thread is waxed to behave. A man sews while another hand keeps the cloth from leaping. It is not a quiet job, but it looks quiet because everyone around it has learned not to narrate. Even meals occur with an eye on the hem. Fish stew tastes better when the leech line is content. A gull may land on the yard to make an announcement, and if it is the kind of day that needs a superstition, someone will interpret the bird as good luck because it was easier than the other option. Storms do not respect textiles, but the sail has strategies. Reef down early is a proverb older than the ship, and the little ties begin to earn their keep. Hands gather a band of cloth up onto the yard and tie it like a neat roll, making the working area smaller and stronger. The ship rides easier. Dignity returns to the deck. The helmsman stops narrowing his eyes at everything. If the world insists on drama, the sail may be dropped entirely and secured in brails, and the ship will then use oars or patience. When the gale quits the lecture, the cloth is shaken out like a blanket after sleep, and salt that thought it would be permanent returns to being decoration. In the morning, if damage has occurred, the mending begins with the same calm as breakfast. A triangular patch, called a palm patch by people who enjoy maiming things after the tool that places them, is stitched across a rib with seams that look like good handwriting. If a grommet has torn away, a ring is seized into the fabric with whipping so tight it could hold an opinion upright in a strong wind. Men who might shout in battle do not shout at a sail. It is an old custom and a good one. On land again, the sail becomes a roof for a market stall, a curtain for privacy, a topic for neighborly critique. Someone comments that the dye has held up well. Someone else remarks that the seamstress in the next village uses a slightly different stitch, which, honestly, has merit. Children set up one corner as a tent and play ship while the adults haul the rest across trestles to examine it for winter storage. The smell of tar warms in the sun, and bees decline to participate, finding it too official. When the sail is finally rolled and sent to the loft, it carries with it traces of places. Fine coastal sand in the creases, black specks of volcanic ash from a far island, a strand of hay from a field that took its time getting harvested because the weather suggested patience. It will sleep in the rafters like a hibernating storm. Sagas notice sails the way poets notice hair. They give them colors and moods and destinies. and once in a while they grant them a line of dialogue disguised as a simile. A fleet approaches with sails as red as blood, which is both an exaggeration and a marketing decision. Another sets out with striped sails that say, "We are not sneaking, we are arriving." Archaeology answers with fragments that look plain but know everything. A piece of cloth from a burial, felted hard with age. A loom weight found in a house where the fire once ran away. A clump of tar with wool embedded like a fossil of work. A carved stone in Scotland shows a ship with a sail that billows so convincingly you can almost feel the tug. Across the north, in museums that smell faintly of maps, the evidence sits under glass while visitors lean on labels and imagine wind indoors. The numbers are gentler than they appear. A big sail for a long ship might cover 60 square meters, perhaps more, perhaps less, depending on the boastfulness of your unit of measurement and your generosity with the yard. That is a house worth of cloth, spun and woven at human speed. The weight, when tarred, might be the weight of a few good men, which is an odd way to describe fabric, and yet the ship never seems to mind. Ropes whisper their diameters, blocks creak their ratios. Even the mast murmurs the quiet geometry of leverage. None of this thinks of itself as mathematics. It is simply the way wood and cloth greet wind and turn it into distance. Domestic life keeps pace with it. The same hands that weave a sail weave clothing that finds its way into graves with brooches like polite anchors. The same tar that blesses a sail blesses a roof seam. The same dye that phrases a stripe on a square phrases a pattern on a skirt. In winter, in rooms that listen for spring, women fold cloth for cloaks and think about the ship's needs, the way gardeners think about neighbors' fences. Children are taught not to play with the loom weights because someone once did and there were tears. Old men tell stories about a sail that split from luff to leech in a wind that had no right to be that proud. Young men pretend they will never have to repair anything. Everyone drinks something warm while these assurances are made. Sometimes for no reason except that the world enjoys a detail, a sail acquires a nickname. Old Gray, because it kept its natural color and outlived gossip. Red Stripe, because someone traded for a bucket of madder root and wanted to see if a line down the middle improved courage. Sleepy, because in light airs it drooped like a cat in a window. Namestick. They are called across decks the way people call to one another, and the cloth forgives the anthropomorphism because with names come care. A named sail is inspected a little more lovingly. It gets put away dry. It is the difference between a jacket and your jacket. The fourth and quietest stretch of this ramble belongs to mending, which is nearly a philosophy. Mending assumes a future. The darn in a sleeve says the arm will find more work. The patch in a sail says there will be wind worth catching and shores worth reaching. A woman at the threshold, bending over a stripe of cloth with her needle humming, is making time itself slightly less alarming. She uses a stitch that crosses itself so damage has to argue with two lines at once. She waxes the thread to teach it manners. She aligns the weave so the patch and the parent cloth agree to age together. When the patch is done, she rubs a little more tar into the area and speaks to no one in particular about the way storms prefer to repeat themselves. In the evening, the men carry the rolled sail on their shoulders like a table laden with invisible meals. If you ask why all this matters, the sail will answer by doing its job so well you forget to ask again. It turns breath into movement. It makes a map into a plan. It translates yarn into speed and speed into stories. It also, and this is not nothing, dries nicely in a spring wind and makes the whole field smell of resin and wool and possibility. I could keep talking about the difference between a yard that likes to bow and one that likes to stay strict about how the bolt rope is spliced so cleanly you cannot find where it began to pretend to be endless about the way a sail casts a square of shadow on a sunny deck, and everybody migrates into it as if shade were an animal you could tame. I could even talk about the little wooden measures marked in thumb widths that sail makers tuck into their belts like sly rulers, or the way a loom weight feels heavy in the pocket like a promise. But at some point, the wind will drop to a whisper, and the square will soften and collapse against the mast, and the ship will drift with the contentment of a bed that has decided to become a boat. If you're still listening, let the wool's memory of sheep and meadow carry you. That's what it was spun for. The yard creaks once the way old trees creak before a storm that never quite arrives. The crew lean back. The tar cools and stops being a smell and becomes merely the air. And the sail, which began as a sheep's calm afternoon, folds itself around the night like heavy cloth around a drowsy thought, and waits for tomorrow's wind with a patience that has nothing left to prove. You might not expect the quietest technology on a Viking ship to be plant gossip twisted into lines, but rope is simply flax and bass deciding to hold hands for the rest of their lives. It begins so softly you could miss it. A lime tree in summer grows long inner fibers under its bark, layers that behave like reluctant hair. Someone scores the bark in neat belts, peels off long sheets, and sinks them in a pond where the water, with the patience of a librarian, loosens the woody parts and leaves the fibers shrugging free. This smells exactly like the word useful, which is not everyone's favorite perfume but keeps a community upright. Flax fields add their own vote, blue flowers nodding to bees, stalks pulled up by the roots when their time has ripened from modest to ready. Bundles dry under eaves and then meet the break, the scutching knife, and the hackle comb in a sequence that sounds violent and is, in truth, a very gentle eviction of everything that doesn't want to be thread. Fibers line up like well-behaved reeds in a wind. A spinner twists them the way a thought tightens into a sentence. Two threads ply together and forget they were ever alone. If you are still awake when I mentioned that the best rope walk is simply a very long path where 3 children can be tricked into turning cranks while an adult watches the twist, feel free to subscribe with the energy of a leaf turning over. Or don't. I will not tattle. The rope will continue to become itself, which is the politest way of saying it never stops. The first work of rope is to become longer. Unspun fibers know how to be close. Twist teaches them how to travel. In the rope walk, an alley between sheds, a lane along the shore, or just the distance from a door to a patient tree-laid yarns stretch in parallel like lines for music. A wooden top with hooks gathers them. A crank at the far end teases on twist. You can hear the fibers decide to collaborate. 3 strands become a hawser. Their lay is opposite to the twist of the yarns, a kind of moral counterweight that keeps the whole thing from sulking apart. A child touches the forming rope and squeals at the tickle. A dog treats the new line as an angel allowed art. When the right tautness hums in the air, the maker rubs grease along the surface tallow, fish oil, a little pine pitch, so weather will be discussed politely rather than personally. If the rope is bound for salt, it may be married to walrus hide thongs or woven with horsehair, the former liking abrasion, the latter liking dignity. The end gets an honest whipped binding and perhaps a tiny eye splice, so the rope can have a way to witness its own efforts. Rope enters the household with the casual authority of a relative who fixes shelves. In the longhouse, it keeps rafters honest, binds thatch where wind debates architecture, and hangs kettles so stew can practice being inevitable. A cradle's swing, after all, is simply rope's patience. Nets, those portable lakes, rely on cord to maintain their grit of hope. Each knot is a tiny handshake between water and supper. A fence's rope convinced to stand tall between posts. A gate is rope remembering how to loop. You can measure the respect a farm gives rope by the tidy coil near the door. A good coil lies flat like a sleeping snail. A bad coil stares up in loops that catch ankles and opinions. Knots teach personality. The square knot is a truce. The clove hitch is a plan. The bowline is a door you can open from the inside. The reef knot, ironically, does not reef sails particularly well unless you want to meet the sea quickly. Still, it ties bandages with quiet competence, and competence forgives names. Now the second, slower scene lowers itself like evening fog, and the ship receives rope the way lungs receive air. Running rigging is rope with ambition. Halyards hoist the yard and therefore hoist the day. Sheets trim the sail and therefore trim conversation. Braces swing the yard so the square face greets wind with the correct cheek. Lift lines cradle weight where wood would otherwise complain. Downhauls remind enthusiasm to be tidy. Each line has its habit of sound. A halyard sings when it runs. A sheet thumps in a half beat against the plank. A brace hums like a bass string at anchor. Ropes talk to the attentive. Frayed strands mutter. Chafe clears its throat. Sailors carry palm guards and big blunt needles, so they can serve a rope with yarn wrapping it in protective sleeves at points of friction or worm and parcel it before serving, which is rope's version of quilts and tea. When a splice is needed, hands unlay strands to their own childhood and tuck them back in new company, crowning the marriage with a taper that runs through fingers like a thought being smoothed. The finished splice passes a stern test. It must slide through a block sheave without causing the kind of pause that makes a helmsman sigh. Knots on board are small biographies. The bowline gives you a fixed eye that refuses to tighten. The rabbit comes up the hole, runs around the tree, and back down. A story so memorable, even tired hands remember it. The round turn and 2 half hitches asks nothing more than patience and never betrays a post. The rolling hitch persuades a line to grip another line, which is more diplomacy than physics. A sheet bend marries cords of unequal size faster than most people marry cousins. A trucker's hitch invents mechanical advantage from air and confidence. So does the purchase on a tackle, where rope passes through blocks in a conversation that multiplies strength, the way gossip multiplies details. If a man's hands know 6 knots well, they will appear to know 60, the way a cook who can boil, bake, and fry appears to own a wizard's hat. Because rope is both tool and neighbor, the ship keeps it healthy. Salt abrades, wind burns. The sun is a quiet thief. Coils are stowed in the shade if the sky permits it, and lockers if the sea suggests it. Wet rope is never coiled tight. It is flaked like a sleeping serpent, so it will dry with dignity. When a long voyage leaves lines polished like old thoughts, someone rubs in grease with the tenderness of shoe care, and the ship smells for an hour like a wholesome combination of barn and forest. Children allowed aboard for a festival swing on lines with an awe that turns immediately into requests, and someone inevitably shows off a trick knot that falls open with a tug as though performed by a stagehand. If you're still awake, imagine the fine rasp of hemp under thumb, a texture like a cat's tongue that believes in you. Third scene. Rope goes away from ships and finds other jobs that seem modest until you try them without rope. Winter in the north straps sleds to horses with harness that trusts its buckles and its cords equally. On ice, men tie bone skates to their boots with thongs that learn stubbornness from walrus hide. The result is gliding that looks like cleverness and is, in fact, simply honest friction management. Fishing lines, spun tighter than fairness, carry hooks superior to appetite. In bogs where men harvest peat, ropes lower blocks, lift courage, and draw sleds along boards laid like thoughts across brown water. Houses raise frames with ropes and laughter. Weddings borrow decorated cords, red-dyed, blue-dyed. A twist like confetti to bind hands for the moment it takes a bargain to become a promise. Funerals lower the dead with ropes that go slack afterward, as if recognizing that their job has ended and silence has taken over. Rope also enters law the way it enters everything, quietly and then indispensably. Wargold schedules do not price rope separately, yet court practice implies respect. A broken ship's cable may be compensation owed, a failed mooring a shared guilt. A boundary marker is a post with a loop. The loop receives a chord. The chord defines the argument until both parties agree that grass cannot be braided forever. At markets, stall lines divide space with a stubborn fairness that keeps elbows from having to legislate. The law speaker, who keeps years of statutes in his head, sometimes fiddles a little hank of cord while he recites, because fingers like to explain to mouths how remembering works. There's humor too, the soft, half-smiling kind that knots excel at. The village prankster ties a longhouse door with a string puzzle that falls open if you pull exactly the wrong way. The victim either solves it with dignity or crawls through the smoke hole and pretends he meant to. Children learn cat's cradle and invent 3 more figures. A grandmother shakes her head at the poor posture of their diamonds and fixes them with a single royal pinch. A fisherman swears by a lucky knot around his float. When it fails him, he swears by the opposite knot for balance. Somewhere, inevitably, a skald composes a verse where a lover unties a belt with a metaphor about moorings, and also, inevitably, the meter rescues the blush with a joke about reef points. The craft of rope grows sideways into cords and lashings that make furniture care about you. A bed can be a frame with rope lattice, tightened with a key until sag becomes embrace. Chairs learn similar lessons. A pack basket takes shape when split hazel meets lashings at intelligent angles. Even the loom relies on heddle cords that lift pattern from idea into cloth. In a house with little iron, rope is metal that can be tied. In a house with much iron, rope is kindness that keeps iron from bruising wood. When a traveler leaves at dawn, someone ties his bundle with a reef knot that will open easily at night. This is love spelled with fiber. We turn into the 4th and last drift of the evening, where rope is memory. Graves cough up tiny coils corroded into green ghosts, where bronze needles and pins once walked through cord. Waterlogged harbors surrender whole wads of anchor cable, preserved by mud into something like fudge, each strand still legible as if it could unlay and show you the hands that twisted it. On land, bogs keep cords intact around the handles of buckets, lashing that held while time considered its options. In museums, a length of Viking Age rope sits under glass like a sleeping caterpillar. The label is never quite interesting enough, because what is a label supposed to do with the fact that these fibers once kept a ship alive? You lean closer and see gravel pressed in, a story of a beach where something heavy dragged and the rope agreed to help without complaint. Archaeologists read rope by its direction of lay, S or Z, clockwise or counterclockwise, fingerprints of workshops and habits. A fragment tells whether yarns were 3 or 4 to the strand, whether a hard twist ambition drove the maker or a soft twist tenderness. It tells you nothing about the jokes told during its making and everything about the hours. In fire-blackened houses, cord impressions lie in the baked clay of collapsed hearth benches, negative photographs of loops that once carried pods. In Viking towns, rope-making wastes short fibers, tar flakes, broken rivets from combs used to hackle flax collects in corners like the biography of work. Each little pile is a paragraph in the life of a neighborhood. Modern analogies whisper in politely because sleep likes context. Rope is the original USB-C cable. It connects anything to anything else, politely, reversibly, and with just enough friction to stay put. It tangles with suspicious speed when ignored. It lives in a drawer that everyone swears they will organize soon. A coil on a ship's deck is simply the medieval version of cable management, and a bowling is the difference between plugged in and, oh no, not again. If you smile and then yawn, that is precisely the point. The best part of rope is the way it forgives. A poor knot can be untied, a frayed section cut out, a line spliced anew. Repairs are not confessions here, but courtesies to the future. Someone sits in the door of the longhouse with a line across his knees, tucks strand under strand with slow certainty, and makes a broken thing become a whole thing. His dog watches with eyelids tilted toward sleep. Smoke finds a way out through the roof hole. A neighbor passes and offers news about the goats. The repaired section looks slightly thicker, like a well-healed scar, and everyone agrees that it is now the strongest piece. You could do worse than borrow that rule for a life. Night brings all the lines to rest. Mooring ropes creak once as the tide rearranges its opinions. Halyards get a loose turn so blocks will not chatter in dreams. Nets dry on the rack in squares that look like quiet windows. Inside, a cradle string receives a last lazy tug. A woman rolls a length of flax between her fingers to feel whether tomorrow's thread will be kind. A boy loops cord around a peg again and again, practicing the bowline until the loop appears as quickly as a remembered name. On someone's belt, a coil of short line hangs from a simple toggle, ready to tie a splint, a bundle, a thought. I could go on, of course, about tarred marline that smells like old decisions, about palm and needle serving that looks like corduroy and feels like armor, about the difference between a sheet bend and a double sheet bend when the ropes are tired or wet, about the clever way an eye splice buries its own tail so neatly that even arrogance applauds. I could describe the solemn, ridiculous elegance of a monkey's fist knot on a heaving line, the weight that gives distance, or the way a coir cable from far coasts surprises northern hands by floating, or the tiny cord lanyards that keep knives from choosing the sea. But the longhouse roof has begun its soft breathing, and the harbor has adopted the same rhythm. Rope is finally only a way to ask pieces of the world to cooperate for a while, and the world, being well-mannered at night, usually agrees. If you drift now, think of fibers aligning, of strands crossing and recrossing, of a loop that opens when asked and holds when needed. Think of hands learning knots until they no longer try to remember them at all. Tomorrow there will be wind and pots and sleds and nets and conversations that need tying off at the end. For now, let every line be slack enough to be kind and taut enough to be true. You might not expect the quiet pulse of a Viking ship to be measured by nails, but a hull is really just wood deciding to stay married to itself one iron kiss at a time. The story begins nowhere near the harbor. It begins in a marsh where bog iron naps in orange freckles beneath moss, as if the earth has been blushing for centuries. People know the places. They prod the wet ground with sticks the way bakers test loaves, and the mud offers up lumpy nodules that look unpromising until you realize they are future voyages pretending to be pebbles. The nodules dry in baskets by the hearth, steaming off their marshy opinions. Then comes smelting, which sounds dangerous and mostly smells determined. A small bloomery furnace of clay and stone is stacked with charcoal and ore in alternating spoonfuls, like a recipe passed down by patient grandfathers. Bellows goatskin lungs wheeze life into the fire. Hours pass in the comfortable boredom of effort, the kind that turns conversation into low murmurs and makes bread taste heroic. When the furnace is finally opened, a spongy mass of iron bloom drops into the world like an ungainly newborn. If you're still awake by the time I admit the furnace lining is scraped for slag in exactly the same way a pot is scraped for porridge, you can subscribe with the soft energy of a nod, or let the bellows rock you toward sleep. The iron will still be there in the morning, cooling its temper like a veteran. The smith's yard is a theater without plot twists. An anvil stands on a stump that knows more oaths than a sailor. The hammer has a handle grown shiny where the hand insists on returning. The bloom is reheated, worked, folded, and purified with strikes that sound like a steady argument finally finding agreement. Bars emerge, square and polite. From these, nails are born. Not the little finished nails that disappear into furniture, but thick, boat-minded fasteners with square shanks and heads clenched like decisions. Each begins as a piece snipped hot from the bar and set on the anvil edge. 2 or 3 blows draw out a taper. Another nip forms a shoulder. A final set gives the head its authority. On good days, a nail is finished in fewer heartbeats than it takes soup to reconsider boiling. The smith works in sequences 20 points, 20 heads, so the rhythm can be trusted. If a child wanders close, the smith lets him step on the bellows once, because every story expects a cameo. Somewhere nearby, a bucket of water pretends to be patient, and tongs hold a glow that wants to speak in vowels. When the bar runs short, the scrap basket yields little tails that will become rivets. Those button-like circles with rows that sit inside a hole like polite coins dot at the boatyard. The iron meets wood with a ceremony that looks like domestic carpentry and is, in truth, polite warfare against water. Planks cut thin and long streaks overlap along their edges like shingles that forgot to settle down on a roof. The builders drill pilot holes with spin bits that carve neat cylinders. A boy with a mallet pretends he is in charge of every rhythm. A girl, if today is generous, is allowed to drive a trundle into a bench just to see it happen. The nail passes from outside through both planks and into a small iron washer-like rove waiting inside. A helper slides the rove over the nail's point and then, with a clinching iron and a backing hammer, upsets the end, mushrooming it neatly so the nail cannot back out without writing a letter of apology. This is clinch nailing, the sound of shipwrights convincing wood to remain community property. Each strike draws two boards into a marriage that creaks at first and then learns to breathe in the same tempo. The line of rows inside glints like a quiet necklace along the ribcage of the hull. The line of nailheads outside looks like punctuation marks in a very long sentence about distance. Wood softens these vows with fiber. Between the overlapping strakes, the seam must be given something kind: moss, lamb's wool, or oakum teased from old rope. Women and men both do this work, pushing caulking into the lap with blunt irons, the way a baker tucks filling into a pie. Pine tar thick, smoky, a perfume that never apologizes warms in a pot and is brushed along the seam so the moss decides to be loyal. The entire workshop smells like an argument between forest and campfire that ends in friendship. Whoever is in charge of the tar earns a day-long halo. The black gloss glazes fingernails, and no soap in the world can persuade it to leave before it has delivered its sermon. When the first seams are done, you can run a finger along the outside and feel the ship's skin change from wood to wood with intent. Where the hull curves toward the bow, nails and roves huddle closer, because curves get ideas and must be reminded about responsibility. A plank that sulks and refuses to lie fair is called stubborn, the way a child is called spirited. Heat, wedges, and persuasion introduce it to a future called obedience. By evening, the hull hums with a new note. You can hear it when you press your ear to the planks, a little tinny because of all that iron, a little warm because the wood has learned how to hold hands with itself. Maintenance is not dramatic, which is exactly why it keeps you alive. On shore days, the crew flips the ship on its side with rollers and leverage, and the bottom greets the air with the sigh of an old seal. Barnacles and lead are scraped away with knives made of bone or bronze iron, is not fond of salt unless tar is in the conversation. Seams are inspected, their moss tested with a thumbnail. Where the lap has opened a hair, new fiber is teased in with a short beater and a patience that feels like knitting. The nail heads get a glance. If a square corner has rounded with time, a shipwright taps it back with a set punch, restoring its seriousness. The roves inside are checked for that quiet, alert fit that says, enough, but not too much. A crack near a nail receives a Dutchman, a little wedge of wood stained to match, and then a smear of tar that shines like a secret. Tools spread across the sand and a neat mess adds auger, dolly, clench iron, mallet, each with a black thumbprint somewhere on its body. Lunch is bread dipped in something salty. Nobody sits on the rove line because everyone's back remembers. Last time at sea, the nails talk in small clicks that only veterans hear. A fresh breeze makes the hull flex microscopically. The iron answers like teeth settling after a yawn. When a wave hammers improperly, a note rings up through the ribs that tells you the next hour will be damp humor. The helmsman adjusts his line so the ship feeds the seas rather than chewing them. If water does find its way in, it follows the nails along the laps, finding every failure of attention. A man crouched inside with his clench iron, braced against a frame, will bang a rivet back into gravity with the same affection he'd use for a stubborn door. Seawater splashes his knees. Tar freckles his wrists. He hums because humming makes the hammer weight less opinionated. Somewhere above, the square sail bellies and relents. The ship goes on measuring the world with sequences of iron that began in a marsh. Iron rusts, of course, and everyone knows it. But rust has manners when given tar and wood. In the overlapping seam, there's less oxygen. Corrosion becomes a slow rumor instead of a fast scandal. When a nail eventually fails, it does so with a sigh rather than a shout. The shipwright drills it out and drives a sibling into the warm vacancy. Old nails collect in a bucket like veterans at a bench, red-brown and flaking, their square shanks still telling you which way the grain once ran. Someone will reuse the least damaged as hooks in the boathouse. Others will return to the hearth, stuck into a crack near the endiron to be reborn in small ways. A hinge pin here, a clasp there, a skewer for fish when the mood forgets to be formal. Nothing in this economy retires. It just changes departments. The craft travels through time in paper-thin clues. Archaeologists kneel at boat graves, brushing sand from rivet lines that survive long after the wood has gone back to its first idea of tree. Patterns appear like stitching on the ghost of a garment. Nail spacing tells you where planks overlapped. Rope size tells you how thick those planks were. The angle and crowding at the bow whisper how boldly the ship curved as it decided to be sharp. 1,000 little washers outline a hole that isn't there and yet is somehow easier to see than if it were. People stand in museums and look down at lines of iron freckles and swear they can feel wind indoors. Scholars count rivets the way accountants count coins. Shipwrights smile because they know that behind those counts are hands, moods, tea breaks, and the occasional curse when a rove slipped and tried to become jewelry. Domestic life also keeps an eye on nails. The same smith who forged boat fastenings makes nails for chests and doors, and the house begins to carry the ship's punctuation. A chest lid closes with a line of heads that gleam like commas. A door strap holds with clenched rivets that look too proud for their job and are, therefore, exactly right. A woman hangs her comb on a nail by the bedpost. A man hangs his knife on one by the hearth. The dog hangs his dreams on a spot of warm sun and feels no need for hardware. When a child swallows a small nail because curiosity is sometimes stronger than sense, the grandmother tells a story so distracting that fear forgets to stay. The child grows up, becomes a carpenter, and drives his first boat rivet with the solemnity of a promise. You can still see children at a boatyard pause to touch a line of nailed plank with one respectful finger. The way some people touch a painting. The language of nails wanders into law and story. Fines list the price of stealing a boat fastener because that is not theft of iron, but theft of distance. Sagas mention a ship well mailed, which is faint praise the way a baker calling bread evenly baked is faint. Anyone who has eaten the other kind hears the compliment. A ghost appears in one tale, demanding that a rivet be returned to its rightful plank. In another, a clever farmhand recovers a lover's ring only by replacing the rove that formed its secret hiding place in the barn wall. None of these stories is true in the strict sense. All are true in the useful sense. Nails are small, and yet when they go missing, you notice how large they were. If you crave a tiny fact before sleep, here's a handful. Square shanks resist backing out because wood fibers close behind them like silk behind a waiting bird. Roves are usually slightly dished. When they are driven home, they flatten and clamp like a sigh, becoming a decision. The nailhead outside is often countersink a whisper into the outer plank, so wear and weather won't keep nipping at it. A good shipwright takes pride in straight rivet lines because neatness inside a hull is a kind of mercy during repairs. And a clinch that has been done firmly but not angrily will last longer than one driven with temper. Iron listens. The fourth quiet turn of this night belongs to the afterlives of these little decisions. A boat abandoned on a shore will lose its ribs and skin to seasons, but the rove lines fall in place like constellations, rusty stars inside a dark idea of shape. Children invent games with them, skip a rove, step to the next, like counting by twos, and inadvertently learn the spacing a carpenter decided on long ago. In waterlogged sites, the nails keep their geometry under layers of preservation. Conservators cradle them like biscuits that might disintegrate, and sometimes they do, leaving prints you can cast as if the iron were only ever a rumor. Drawings in books show dotted holes, and ship historians write captions in voices nearly as sleepy as mine. Rivet pattern suggests 5 streaks per side. Additional rows at stem indicate heavy hooting ends. Somewhere a researcher sighs with happiness, because a line of dots turned into a curve that matches a model, and the room smells faintly of old paper and wet leather gloves. If you lift your head now and imagine a Viking ship cutting along in late light, the satin shadow under the strakes looks smooth, but it is really the city work of thousands of small agreements. Every lap carries its moss, every moss carries its tar, every tar remembers a tree that shared its sap. Every nail remembers a marsh and a furnace and a hammer face. The sea, of course, remembers none of it. The sea is generous and rude. It simply presses and lets itself be carried by the planks, and all the while the nails make their small, contented clicks, like knitting needles in a great-grandmother's lap. If you're still awake, you can think about the way a ship can be reborn just from those clicks left in the ground. You can think about a smith raising a bar from a bloom with the same patience you raise a blanket at your chin. Or you can let the iron go dark in the forge while the bellows rest their ribs, and let the tar cool to a quiet black, and let the planks stop talking for the night. The harbor is full of commas, not periods. Somewhere a boat creaks as the tide changes its mind. Somewhere a bucket of old nails dreams of being useful again. Somewhere a seam finds the perfect shape of tight and stays there, breathing with the hull. Tomorrow the hammer will sing. Tonight the ship lies still, held together by small decisions that do not need applause. You might not expect the sleepest object in a Viking kitchen to be the one that could break your foot, but the heart of the longhouse stew was a rock soft enough to carve, heavy enough to stay put, and patient enough to simmer a winter. Soapstone pots do not look ambitious. They look like someone persuaded a boulder to become a bucket, yet they fed farms and voyages for centuries, humming along above fire like a cat that learned to purr in slow motion. The story of one of these pots begins quietly in a hill that is not trying to be dramatic. A seam of steatite runs like gray butter through harder rock. Quarrymen know the places because their fathers pointed out the slopes where sheep drift and said, "There." It's not a mind so much as a conversation with a cliff. Wedges open the face. Hammer and chisel worry out slabs. The dust falls on a gentler snow that smells like a wet stone thinking. Soapstone is talk-rich and lets itself be shaped without the tantrums that granite enjoys. Blocks are pride-free with levers laid on sleds and dragged downhill by patient people tied to patient ropes. The sled's runner is greased with a little tallow or the courtesy of wet moss. If you're still awake by the time we slide the third block past the alder stump, you may subscribe with the effort of a yawn. Or you can keep drifting. The stone will continue down the path with or without applause dot in the workshop. The block becomes an almost pot. Artisans choose a circle with a charcoal string and score it until a groove appears that means business. A bow drill is too polite for this job. Instead, a goosewing adds picks and chisels persuade the blank to roundness. The inside is hollowed by pecking and scraping, a sound like rain deciding to be mathematical. Some makers use a T-shaped tool with an iron bit, turning it by hand while grit and water do most of the work. The outside is spoke-shave simple. Shave, stroke, check, repeat, the pot slowly learning its future. Soapstone, so obliging on the edge of a tool, is also a structural realist. It prefers broad curves to sharp corners. It forgives thickness. It dislikes arrogance. Lugs for the hanging cord are left as proud ears, drilled through at the end so rope can find home. A lid is educated out of another slab, often with a shallow rim that nests like a polite hat. A ladle notch may be added by someone who imagines midnight. Handles carved of the same stone are rare because weight already has opinions, but a modest collar below the lip gives you a place to grip with cloth without inventing drama. The maker rubs the finished surface with fat to bring out a soft sheen, as if the pot has remembered rain. After a short seasoning over low heat water, a fist of oats, an apology for impatience, the vessel is ready to live, where smoke is a ceiling more than a condition dot in the longhouse. The pot's genius is not temperature. It is time. Soapstone warms slowly and forgets slowly. Heat moves through it the way bedtime moves through a story. The pot is slung from a crossbeam by rope or chain, high when the fire is young and boastful, lower as it falls into reason. Inside, the ongoing stew is less recipe than neighborhood. Bits of dried fish surrender their stubbornness. A bone contributes structure. Barley pretends to be weather. Someone adds onions, which do not exist in the sagas but exist very loudly in reality. Someone else shakes in herbs in a quantity that would embarrass a garden. The liquid is ladled out all day to anyone who walks in damp and leaves steamed. When it runs low, more water, more barley, more possibility. Travelers call it perpetual stew. Locals call it dinner. The pot does not scorch easily, which is helpful for a meal that is often ignored on purpose. It also does not crack in the face of sudden heat the way clay might. Not when it is properly thick, not when it has been seasoned with oil as a teacher. It can sit in coals like a king in furs and blink at the world with heavy lids. If a skald comes by and wants to shout about heroes, the pot replies by thickening quietly. A pot like this changes a day's choreography until the day. Imagines it was always meant to be that way. Morning begins with embers encouraged back into a squad. A ladle wooden, slightly scorched at the story end, tests the night's gravity. The first sip is the house's weather report. If it tastes thin, someone smiles and says the day will require bread. If it tastes thick, someone smiles and says the day will require an extra spoon. Children circle with invented errands. They are told to fetch water and return with small, shiny cheeks. A slotted spoon rescues bones because nobody wants to chew philosophy at breakfast. The pot's rim is always a little slick, a ring of proof that fat has been eating history one day at a time. The smoke hole lets the flavor escape upward, a polite share with the rafters. Cats sit where the drip is slowest and call it theology. Second scene. Slower and warmer. The pot's relationship with fire is a marriage. They keep each other from foolishness. Fire quenches rain, but also invents it, turning liquid into cloud. The stone keeps the heat steady enough for the barley to believe in the future. When the fire gets ambitious, the pot can be raised by a notch in the chain or by twisting the rope one turn tighter. This is temperature measured in finger widths and patience. You can hear the stew announce its intentions. A bubble climbs the wall and decides whether to speak. A piece of root chuckles. A halibut bone admits it is done contributing. When a celebratory animal has been carved to reason, the meat that might have been wasted collar, shank, oddities, finds honorable retirement here. On good days, someone adds a splash of sour whey. On practical days, reindeer milk. On hungry days, more water and a shrug. Salt is used like news, carefully, sparingly, and only after someone says, "Are you sure?" Soapstone's other virtue, which sounds boring until you do not have it, is inertia with opinions. It tolerates thermal shocks better than clay and resists the iron taste that copper gives to the ungrateful. It can be repaired when life speaks too loudly. If a fissure opens near a lug, staples of soft iron can be driven across the crack after drilling small holes. A surgeon's calm in a blacksmith's yard. The pot will look like it has learned something and therefore will be trusted more. A missing chip on the rim invites a ferrule of iron band, riveted on like a wedding ring. And if a chunk breaks because someone tripped over a dog while carrying it, this is a very common archaeological category. The pieces can be ground to rub against each other in a fit so close that water will not find a way through unless it is trying to be a lesson. A slurry of talc dust and fat is encouraged into the scene. The pot sits vacant for a day like a convalescent, and then, because kitchen lives must go on, returns to duty and accepts compliments without interest. When the house travels, the pot sometimes goes too, because stew does not believe in borders. On a ship, a smaller soapstone kettle nests in a square of stones on the hearth near the mast. It does not rattle. It hums. Fish that were in the water an hour ago agree to be broth without fuss. Dried seaweed cuts into ribbons. Now the ocean has been invited to be soup twice. Sailors talk about currents in a way that suggests they're politely gossiping about relatives. The pot listens, thick-walled, never in danger of jolting to pieces. During a beaching, the stew will hang from a tripod of driftwood, the wind finding the smoke and wearing it like a shawl. If you're still awake, imagine a spoon passing from hand to hand with the same absent-minded reverence people give shared stories. The world keeps moving. The broth tells everyone it is possible to move slowly inside it. Third scene. The pot is also a calendar because it measures harvests and flavors. In spring, the stew knows fresh sorrel and the shy green of new leeks. It tastes like hope with a little dirt in it. Summer brings milk things and fish that arrived with grins, thickening the broth into something like memory. Autumn is roots and serious decisions. The pot turns orange with carrots and persuasive with turnips. It learns venison's accent. Winter is barley's kingdom, when everything else has been used, and the pot becomes an artifact of patience, sips becoming conversations instead of meals. The guest can read a farm in a bowl. If the soup is disciplined, the farm had a decent haymaking. If it is loud with meat, someone traded well, or someone married better. If barley is shy, the harvest was wet. The pot does not judge. It interprets. Domestic stories cling to its rim like fat that has earned citizenship. A baby's first solid food tastes like whatever the stew is doing that day. Thus babies learn to trust barley and the taste of reasoning. A grandmother's last easiest meal tastes the same, and thus closings rhyme with openings. Men returning from raids report their news while the pot sends up small punctuation marks. A woman listening with half an ear stirs exactly once, the kind of stir that says, "All right then." A girl practicing a song finds her pitch by the steam, because steam is a tuning fork if you are honest. Lovers whisper across the fire and laugh softly when the lid clacks like a chaperone who fell asleep. A cat touches the hot lid and learns a new vocabulary. These details make no appearance in chronicles, which were busy with kings but the pots remember, and archaeologists pick up fragments that still smell faintly of dinners where the large events of history could not find a chair. Soapstone also went to work in smaller ways, spreading its quiet utility across the house. Flat slabs became griddles where oatcakes considered the future. Little cups warmed ointments that claimed to fix ribs, thoughts, and courage with equal reliability. Lamp bodies were carved with shallow basins and fitted with twisted toe wicks that drank fermented fat with soft delight. The flame steady because the stone refused to be hurried. A soapstone loom weight gave a warp the kind of encouragement that linen respects. These objects traveled well. They were gifted to new households like advice that doesn't embarrass. A chipped lamp found in a field centuries later tells a story longer than King's because the light it gave extended actual evenings. Because the material is soft, decoration was not rare. It was simply cautious. Makers incised simple lines around a pot's shoulder chevrons, cords, a row of dots like thoughtful geese. These were not meant to impress visitors. They were meant to reassure hands. If you recognize the pattern near the handle in the semi-dark, you have picked up the right pot, the one that forgives you. Some people scratch runes into the underside a name, a little boast, a protective word because even a stew vessel appreciates a passport. If a quarrel broke out at a feast about which pot belonged to which family, a respected aunt turned them both upside down and read the signatures like a judge. The court adjourned when the stew said it was time to eat. The fourth and last drift of attention tonight belongs to afterlives and archaeology, which are admittedly very soft hooks for sleep and therefore perfect. Soapstone survives fire like a monk and water like a proverb. When longhouses burned, the pots slumped but did not flee. They became shallow bowls that archaeologists must name for a morning and then correct with a shrug. When farm sites were abandoned, vessels were left in corners with their lids on, waiting as loyally as dogs who had not been told the plan. And graves, yes, people sometimes went to the next world with reasonable cookware. Small soapstone cups sit by the knee, as if someone feared the afterlife might begin with cold porridge. Quarries remain with half-cut pots still hugging the bedrock, the human intention visible in curves that were meant to be finished Thursday. You can run a hand along one of those ancient almost circles and feel exactly where a chisel paused for lunch. Scholars do the measurable things. They test the rock's talc content. They map old trade routes because a pot made in a Norwegian valley shows up centuries later on a farmhouse hill in Iceland and in a boathouse across the islands where kelp is called respect. They analyze soot to find out which fat burned in which lamp, a fussy question with quiet charm. They weigh the repair staples and argue about whether a crack was caused by sudden cold, water, or by a cousin who insisted on stirring with enthusiasm. They publish drawings of rim profiles that are indistinguishable at first glance and deeply different at the angle of responsibility. And still, after all the tidy numbers, what remains is the sense of a domestic instrument that traded applause for reliability and won. A modern analogy hums along the table here, and then we can let the stew go back to being itself. Soapstone cookware is the medieval equivalent of a slow cooker that also happens to be a space heater, a humidifier, a family therapist, and a calendar. You set it in the right place, you feed it without hurry, and it pays you back in portions that taste like a good decision. It forgives neglect and makes leftovers feel planned. It ages out of beauty into authority. It can be inherited without comment. If you smiled at that, it is because you have tasted a simmer that had been thinking all day. Night folds over the longhouse with the careful hands of someone putting away clean cloth. The pot is nudged higher so embers can say their farewells. The lid goes on with a click that sounds exactly like the word tomorrow. A ladle rests across the handles, a bridge for any ghost who might enjoy soup, because hospitality is cheap if you prepare it once and let it remain. Someone tips a splash of water on a stubborn coal. A hiss answers with winter's whisper. The last person, up often the one with the least glamorous chores, gives the pot a single ceremonial stir. Not for cooking, for continuity. Outside, frost starts doing arithmetic on the grass. Inside, the stew rearranges itself quietly into the shape of morning. If you drift now, do it with the knowledge that a very heavy, Very gentle object is doing your worrying for you. It has all night. It prefers it that way. Asterisk. You might not expect the sleepless sound in a Viking settlement to be the tick of a stone, but weaving begins when a loom weight decides to be patient. One small disc of fired clay, or a cut of soapstone with a hole through its middle, hangs at the end of a warp thread and performs the most boring, most faithful task in the world. It remembers down. From that unglamorous memory, shirts arrive, sails take wind, blankets keep children from having to grow courage at midnight. The first part of the tunic's life has nothing to do with cloth. It begins in the spring, when sheep shed the winter like an old rumor. Women and men sit with combs and tease out tangles, while ewes make commentary in bowels. A single fleece is a biography with burrs. Lanolin greases the fingers until every touch feels like a promise. Locks are sorted by length because even wool respects order. Long fibers become warp that must endure tension. Short fibers will be allowed to drift into the weft because sideways is gentler. While the combs sing their thin metal tune, a spindle whirls. Not a spinning wheel, those will come later with their furniture energy, but a simple drop spindle. A stick with a whirl that stores twist the way a jar stores dry peas. The spinner walks, spins, and loops the growing yarn into a neat butterfly on the wrist. If you are still awake by the time the spindle kisses the floor and is rescued with a toe, feel free to subscribe with the same minimal effort. Your finger is a loom weight now, remembering down. The thread gathers into skeins that smell faintly of sheep and leather, and the day goes on without doing anything dramatic, just the usual small, inevitable alchemy of twist. The warp-weighted loom looks like a doorframe that decided to study physics. A beam at the top holds a horizon of threads. Below, rows of weights tug them straight so the fabric can earn its manners. The loom leans against a wall in the longhouse, angled as if listening. Sunlight takes the hint and slips across the threads, making a map of verticals. The weaver stands with 1 foot forward, like a dancer who has forgotten the music, and is therefore perfect. First, the warp is dressed. Threads are measured on a warping board, looped and laced onto the beam in tidy bundles that are called leashes, which is an honest word. Half the threads are captured in one set of heddles, little loops of cord that can lift them together, and the other half remain politely in the back, waiting their turn. Pull the heddle bar toward you, and the front threads rides. Let it fall, and they return to democracy. A weft thread, wound on a shuttle, passes through the opening. This is the shed, and a beater made of wood or comb worn shiny by long days presses the weft into place with a sound that becomes a metronome for breath. The earliest inches are woven with purposefully tighter beat to form a firm starting edge. The rest follows like speech. If the weaver must leave, a stick is slid through the shed to keep the debate from collapsing into opinion. The loom does not mind being interrupted. It exists to turn interruption into rhythm. Yarn never arrives at the loom naked. It stops by the dye pot to consider colors with the seriousness of a cloud deciding on shade. Woad goes first, a plant that looks too polite to darken a warrior, but does it anyway with a blue that improves when you stare at it. The chemistry is patient and strange. The vat is kept low oxygen and warm. Yarn goes in yellowish green, emerges insulted at the air, and turns blue while everyone pretends not to watch. Madder gives red as if clay had learned to imitate berries. Birch leaves yield pale grains. Onion skins whisper gold. Bog iron liquor offers a brown that looks like a story told twice. Mordant's alum, iron, tannin from oak galls are the courteous conspirators, binding color to fiber the way friends hold you to promises you made while cheerful. A skein is dyed unevenly, not because anyone is careless, but because handwork refuses to be a spreadsheet. Later, that slight wandering of tone will make the cloth look alive. To test fastness, a dyer ties a little strand to her belt and walks around for a week. If it is still behaving by Sunday, the recipe wins a name. Faded garments become overdy experiments. Blue over yellow becomes a green that remembers winters. Red over blue becomes a purple that never announces itself out loud. Someone once dipped a gray skein left in iron water too long, and the tunic that came from it became the favorite of a man who did not enjoy attention, which is exactly how color theory intended things. The loom's first inches are also a tally of errors in their schooling. A warp thread breaks because life breaks, and the weaver ties in a supplemental length with a weaver's, not small enough to hide in a poem. A heddle loop loosens. It is retied with a mutter and a smile. Weft tension wanders left as a young dog wanders. The beater tap becomes a little firmer on that edge to bring the border back to sober. Loom weights swing gently when someone walks by. The movement braids itself into the cloth as imperceptible forgiveness. Children watch and are allowed to touch the smooth stone weights because they are learning gravity through their hands. The weaver works downward, rolling finished cloth up at the top beam and unrolling more warp below, so the fabric grows toward the floor like a practical waterfall. Micro hooks appear naturally every few breaths, a knot that resembles a moon. A slub in the weft that will later be a small hill to catch light. A thread that insists on squeaking in the heddle as if it were a mouse practicing vows. The steady shuffle lift, pass, beat washes thought into that pleasant empty place where a day can pass unnoticed. Someone clears their throat behind you. You answer without words by letting the beater fall twice, yes. Yes, because looms invent their own sign language when conversation. Wood still tempo. Cloth leaves the loom with the personality of a teenager, confident, resilient, and a little scratchy. Finishing is where it learns to be kind. The new web is fulled in warm water with soap if there is soap, with stale urine if there is not. The fibers relax and then lock together as they are agitated. Fulling boards knead like bakers. Stones roll like opinions. Hands work the fabric against itself until it decides to become one thing. Later, the cloth is stretched on a frame to dry square, brushed with teasels or birch twigs to raise a slight nap, and then sheared with long blades so it lies even as thought. The selvages, the woven edges, are folded under and whip-stitched. The cut edges for the neck and arm slits are blanketed with sturdy overcast stitches that refuse to unravel. A neckline is sometimes faced with tablet-woven trim, whose tiny threaded tablets produce bands as strong as a sentence diagram and nicer to look at. Wool that began the year as weather now behaves like courtesy. The tunic can finally show up without needing to apologize for itself. Pattern making for a Viking tunic refuses drama and therefore feels modern. Rectangles, triangles, and a willingness to get along. Cloth is expensive in time, so the design avoids waste. A central body panel is cut as a long rectangle. Two narrower rectangles become sleeves. Triangular gores are inserted at the sides and sometimes in the front and back to turn walking into grace. Geometry does all the flirting. Seam allowances are narrow because every thumb width saved is a thumb width earned. Running stitches with small bites secure seams. Overcast stitches protect raw edges. At stress points, a tailor puts in a bar tack that looks like confidence. The neck opening is a vertical slit. It stays closed with a small pin of bone or bronze that likes to be lost exactly twice and then learned. For warmth, a Hoodmore rectangle plus triangles attaches with a few sensible stitches or is worn separately like a private weather system. If you look closely, you discover that fit is almost entirely about drape and habit. The garment hangs from the shoulders, not from the myth of a perfect torso. A belt gathers it at the waist into features that architecture would call folds and a poet would call decisions. Clothing inherits work. A tunic worn to the fields fades at the shoulders where the sun writes in longhand. and the cuffs polished to a darker song where tools speak with palms. Knees gloss where kneeling is a career. Elbows thin first. A patch is applied before the whole declares independence. Patches are not shame. They are footnotes. Some are square, some are borrowed from an old garment gone to pages. Most are stitched with a sort of neatness that can only be achieved by people who know nobody will admire it. Darning a hole involves weaving new weft through surviving warp, or new warp through surviving weft, until the little window is glazed with thread, and then encouraged to behave with a few scolding stitches around its edge. Children learn to darn on socks that belong to nobody. The first attempt looks like an enthusiastic wasp nest. The second looks like a wasp nest that learned economy. By the third, the darn lies so flat that only a shadow can find it. It is common to add reinforcement patches inside the shoulders, where carrying yokes chew. These strengthen the cloth and also make the wearer stand better, which is useful when news from the harbor requires composure. If a tear runs along the weft, it is couched with a ladder of stitches that converts panic into architecture. Every mend moves the garment from object to relationship. Asterisk. Colors age with a quiet honesty that books envy. Woad blue drifts toward sky after many summers. Meadow red softens to brick. Birch leaf green sets down its burden and becomes straw. Overdy keeps life interesting. A garment that was once yellow receives a late autumn dip in woad and emerges with a green that looks like a moss wall after rain. Feast tunics earn embroidery and small metal plaques that catch firelight like punctuation. Work tunics accumulate a different embroidery made of ash, grease, and narrative. On holy days or brave days, someone weaves a tablet-woven braid with pattern. Tablets turn forward and then backward to make ram's horn motifs march. The braid is stitched along the hem so dancing has borders. People remark that the wearer looks well, which is social code for the warp and weft of life having shaken hands for once. When the tunic finally tires in public, it retires to prestigious second careers. It becomes an underlayer beneath a male shirt because wool keeps secrets about temperature. It becomes strips to wrap a baby until the baby invents its own weather. It becomes wicks for lamps, twisted tight and ambitious. The sound of shears taking a sleeve is never theatrical. It is the sound of utility continuing. Very late, threads are pulled from the sturdy seams to repair other things that plan on living. The garment ends by being everywhere in small ways. Even dust from brushing the nap becomes nest material for birds who like their babies to start life with a history. Travel with it briefly, and we can let the cloth go to sleep. A chieftain's hall lights itself in winter with 100 flames. Above them, a new sail is being stitched from widths of thick wool, woven looser than tunic cloth, and proofed with lanolin and fish oil until water becomes an opinion instead of a problem. The same motions that built a shirt now shape a voyage. Lift, pass, beat. Lift, pass, beat. Seams are felled one edge, folded down, and stitched flats, so wind cannot sneak an argument in. Sailcloth is paneled in narrow widths because looms are not enormous. Those widths are the ribs of distance. On deck months later, the sail tugs and releases with a sigh that is also heard when someone stands from the fire and the tunic lifts and settles again. The sea does not know it is making metaphors. It is busy being itself. But clothes know. They keep applying the same quiet solutions to different kinds of movement. Meanwhile, the everyday tunic moves through social weather. A person enters a byre to milk in the early dark. Wool takes the warm fog as a compliment. Another sits at the law rock and listens to opinions while the hem gathers dust that will later tell in archaeologists which soil that person preferred. A bride's new garment carries a little madder thread hidden in the hem for luck. A widow's tunic bears a narrow tablet border dyed with the shadow of iron. None of this is dramatic. It is comfort performing history slowly. Even status sneaks around without knocking. A finer worsted weave lies flatter because the fibers were combed into alignment before spinning. Someone notices without mentioning it, which is the exact level of attention most of us prefer. Here and there, absurdities worth smiling at drift by on the thread. A shepherd swears that his ewes spin better wool when praised individually, and his neighbor pretends not to try it and later pretends surprise when it works. The dyer discovers, after accident and weather, that nettle soup spilled into the woad vat gives a blue that refuses to fade on elbows, and this becomes local fashion for people who lean on things. A child ties a tiny knot in a weft and calls it a secret. 10 years later, the knot is still there, soft as a memory you do not need but like to carry. A lawman declares that a man who steals loom weights has stolen not stones but summers, and therefore owes more than he can count without help. A skald praises a hero's sword and only later, as an afterthought, compliments the shirt that allowed the sword to get where it needed to be. Domestic audiences applaud the afterthought louder than the sword. Archaeology enters finely with its small brushes and gentler lungs. In longhouse floors, rows of loom weights lie where they fell when beams were lifted for the last time. Their arrangement outlines the width of the fabric, the number of warp bundles, the way a hand liked to group threads by comfort. Heddle rods have rotted, but their shadows remain as discolored stripes in the earth. Archaeologists kneel and see the warp rising again in their minds. Textile fragments survive in graves where bronze broach created little chemistry theaters. The cloth mineralized along the metal, leaving a ghost negative that conservators coax into photographs and words. Under microscopes, twist direction reveals whether the spinner turned the spindle clockwise or anti-clockwise. A scholar says S-twist or Z-twist with the satisfaction of someone who found the seam allowance at last. A tiny patch of tablet woven border arrives at a museum tray, accompanied by a card that reads, in tidy script, "Wool, blue and something that wanted to be red." The curator writes a grant to find the something, but the best part was already the honesty. Modern analogies hover, yawning, and then land. A warp-weighted loom is a standing desk that pays your rent in cloth. A tunic cut from rectangles is capsule wardrobe logic written in weatherproof. A dye pot is a mood board that stains your fingers. Darning is software patching, but warmer. The domestic genius of it is this: everything is almost interesting. Nothing insists. The work builds the world while the world thinks about dinner. If you want a very small fact to drift off on, try this. A loom weight of about 6 ounces exerts the sort of tug on a warp bundle that makes 20 threads remember who they meant to be. You could replace the weight with a bag of pebbles, but then you would lose the little click they make when they bump in a breeze, which is half of what the room sounds like when no one is speaking. Night goes soft around the rafters. Someone hangs the heddle bar on its pegs, so tomorrow's first gesture can be a return instead of a beginning. The shuttle rests on the sill where the moon can decide whether to be practical. A tunic on a peg leans into its own folds as if listening to old talk. The loom weights dangle a hair's breadth above the floor and think heavy thoughts. Outside, sheep dream entangled sentences that will be combed into clarity come spring. If you're still awake, you can pick at the image of a single thread crossing another over, over, under, until it stops being structure and starts being comfort. But you don't have to. The cloth is perfectly capable of becoming morning on its own. The house will open its eyes to the same patient metronome. Lift, pass, beat. Lift, pass, beat. The day will borrow its first warmth from wool that wore yesterday's weather and forgave it. Nothing concludes. Everything continues. The last thing you hear might be the smallest sound of all. A light tap of stone against stone where the weights kiss once and then rest and then keep remembering down. Asterisk. You might not expect the dullest sound in a Viking settlement to shape the day's politics, but the scrape of a wooden ladle against a soot-black pot does a lot of quiet governing. Dawn is cold and damp at the longhouse threshold, where heat from last night's embers has slunk away like a guest who left without saying goodbye. A concubine wakes before the first proper light because heat likes early company. She stirs ash to find the glow, lays kindling like a set of careful ideas, and coaxes up a flame with the same patience she will later use for people. Porridge thickens at the edges. Barley swells with the lazy confidence of something that already knows the answer. There is fetching to dew water from a well that understands the shorthand of ropes, wood from a store that remembers the weight of last winter. She moves about the longhouse in a sequence of non-events, sweeping with a birch broom that believes in straight lines, straightening sleeping robes, unrolling a woven mat to make the floor remember being clean. If you're still awake by the time the porridge decides to become agreeable, you're welcome to subscribe to this routine. It requires only a spoon and the ability to notice when steam makes small halos. Smoke crawls along the ridgepole as men cough themselves back into being useful, but the quiet work has already decided the weather inside. The concubine helps dress children whose sleeves do not yet understand their arms. She checks the storeroom where cheeses harden into a philosophy of waiting, counts dried fish with her fingertips so the numbers will accept conviction, and rolls a cask just enough to hear whether the ale is planning to be cooperative. Someone's cloak needs a stitch. It receives one with all the ceremony of a breath. On many mornings, she is the first climate the household meets. A lord's wife may inspect stores and direct servants with the measured tone of a bell. The concubine roots around that authority like water, filling spaces where a small favor will prevent a later storm. She does not announce it, but the day often runs on her non-announcements. This domestic temperature makes room for the other half of her labor, which is less visible and more precisely felt. The pillow does a little politics after night falls. In corners, voices lower, and reputations loosen just enough to look like the inside of a glove. A concubine's ear becomes a ledger that nobody set out to keep. She learns the names that shouldn't share a boat, the feud that is bored and wants to retire, the nephew whose confidence could be redirected with a single kind word from the right person. None of it is recorded on parchment. It is written on arrangements of bowls at breakfast, on whose handed the ladle first, on which jest travels unchecked around the fire. She does not command the hall. She oils it. If a guest with wandering intentions arrives, she is stationed like a polite fence near the goats. A small phrase, "The road was good," can be an evaluation disguised as courtesy. When a chieftain's companion acts without thinking, she brings him a cup and says nothing while he drinks and finds an afterthought. In sagas, this kind of work is invisible. In houses, it decides how loudly doors must be closed. Near midday, there's cloth. Garments need mending the way roads need sweeping. She pulls the light closer and threads a bone needle with a length of wool, the color of sensible weather. A tear in a sleeve is a geography problem. The rip runs along the weft, which believes in sideways. The new thread climbs across like a bridge built by an optimist. Darning looks like patience practicing. It is in fact economics learning to be modest. While she works, she listens, because weaving and listening share a rhythm that doesn't ask for applause. Guests talk more freely to hands that are busy. How is the fjord? Someone asks without asking what the boats are really catching. How is your brother's knee? Someone else says when they mean, has he stopped arguing with iron? The concubine stores these answers behind the eyes the way a house stores cool in its shaded corner. It will come in handy when she needs to align two opinions later, or gently step a rumor away from a ledge. The day's middle is crowded with tasks that refuse any drama. Cheese must be turned so it matures on both sides of the argument. Sacks are checked for mice by listening, not by looking, because mice enjoy surprise. Leeks are chopped for stew, their green rings measuring time like tree trunks and slices. Onions explain in their way that eyes cry for many reasons. She rubs fat into a shield rim to quiet splinters, and in the same hour recites a small song to a fretful child that includes precisely the number of geese required to achieve drowsiness. A visitor, perhaps a poet with an appetite, asks if the stew will be ready soon. She answers with a glance toward the pot that makes even the poet understand that time is a liquid and he has not yet learned to swim. When the meal finally rounds the bend into serving, she moves bowls like punctuation so conversation does not run on into nonsense. Everybody eats. Nobody remarks that a stable table is the most valuable artifact of all. Evening brings his long persuasion. Fires throw the kind of flattering light that turns a scar into biography. Men talk larger than their footprints. Boys fold themselves into the shape of listening. Songs repeat the parts of truth that are most convenient for singing. The concubine settles slightly behind the arc of voices where decisions take a nap before they are made. She keeps one eye on the doorway for the person who always arrives late and feels most injured about it. A cup is waiting for him because sulks dry out better when rinsed. Pillow talk returns in miniature across the benches. A shoulder leaned against is a treaty. A laugh that comes one beat too quickly is a warning. The concubine has 2 jobs at such times: to keep the stew from burning a second time, and to keep the night from swallowing its own tail. When sleep finally drapes the longhouse like a sensible cloak, the kind of peace that can be carried through a winter has been made, thread by invisible thread. If the longhouse is the stage for comfort, the farmyard is rehearsal for loyalty. The wife has official standing, the kind that makes the law nod. The concubine holds unofficial bandwidth, the kind affection chooses when it wants privacy. Most of the time, the 2 roles plow in parallel without colliding. The household likes both women to believe they are necessary because, in fact, they are. But the ground between necessity and jealousy is fertile, watered by inheritance, warmed by glances, and planted with old sayings. The wife oversees dowry cloth, keychains heavy with the arithmetic of storage, and a guest list's moral weather. She has kin who will stand up loudly if anyone forgets it. The concubine holds smaller things that often turn out to be levers: a young man's embarrassment, the location of a misplaced brooch that could become a quarrel, the steadiness of a child who trusts her to untie stubborn knots. There is room for rivalry because the household center is a moving target. Courtesies do steady work. A wife might ask the concubine to sample a new ale first, praising her sense for flavors. A concubine might ensure the wife's favorite stool warms near the fire before she sits, as if by accident. These gestures keep weather mild. Still, there are hard edges. The law counts wives, concubines, and children differently when property changes address. An aside at a feast, only half a jest, delivered whole, can make the hall listen sideways for the rest of the winter. The concubine learns to step around these knots with the delicacy of walking on thawing ice, slow, flat-footed eyes on the far shore. She distributes her laughter carefully so it never looks aligned with a faction. When gifts are given, she praises the giver twice and the object once. When gifts are not given, she compliments the wisdom of saving for spring. In a pinch, she volunteers to carry a message that would be impolite for anyone else to carry. That way, the message arrives and nobody appears to have sent it. Asterisk sagas. When they bother to look up from battles, preserve a few whispering snapshots. A concubine supplies a verse to a warrior and he remembers the exact right boast at exactly the right wrong time. Later the verse, not the warrior, is repeated. A house's second woman is said to have kept the account books in her head and the head of the house in polite order. Another is accused, unfairly, accurately, it depends on which bench you sat on, of reminding a chieftain that bravery is sometimes an elegant word for poor scheduling. Poetry hides in corners of this story. Love affairs occur not in the blaze of noon, but beside the storage jars where the smell of dried apple tries to hold summer in its mouth. Verses carved into runestone praise women as generous with ale and counsel. Another calls someone peace weaver, which is a phrase any concubine would accept with the tiny smile of a person who recognizes professional jargon. Forbidden romances do happen. They do not shout. They tap twice on the far wall. They leave a ribbon of blue thread where only one person will see it. They become a two-line poem that nobody admits to understanding. Asterisk. The wider world intrudes like weather that does not knock. Some concubines entered these households through negotiation or affection. Others arrived by mechanisms that refuse romance capture in raids, sale, collateral for debt. There's no soft way to say it, so it is said plainly and then how gently. Slavery existed, and some women's days were written by people who valued them as property. In the house, a concubine taken in a raid might be treated as kin by degrees or as asset by habit. Her future could bend toward freedom if children were acknowledged, or toward perpetual service if nobody remembered to imagine otherwise. Even within that economy, small agencies persisted. A woman could make herself indispensable in one task: brewing, midwifery, dye work, the keeping of accounts, until her opinion was a tool the house reached for before it reached for iron. She could adopt a language quickly enough that gossip forgot to exclude her. She could align herself with the house's quietest loyalties so that when decisions tilted, she tilted with them and landed on the stable side. Not all stories allow rescue. Many permit improvement, and people take what is permitted. Wealth reshapes how a concubine's shadow falls on the wall. With children, she might see her status rise like bread in a patient oven. A son running around with soup on his face is also a legal category negotiating for space at the inheritance table. A daughter learning to weave is a filament connecting households that will one day exchange gifts. The woman who bore them sits neither at the high table nor on the floor. She sits where she can reach both easily. Silver arm rings appear. Fine wool arrives with the stiffness of confident cloth, and a brooch shaped like something that could be a bird catches light in a way that makes a point without words. Other times the future is smaller, a guarantee of food, a corner near the hearth, a promise that her old age will not stand. These are not legend's rewards. They're the sort of steady outcomes that let ordinary knights be content with being knights. Travel returns often in these histories because boats keep wandering into sentences. A raiding party brings home not just goods, but people who will be asked to learn the house's version of ordinary. A concubine who speaks an Eastern tongue teaches a child a counting rhyme nobody else knows. And years later, that child will use the rhythm to pace steps through a difficult patch of sea. A woman from the West shows how to set fish on racks at a slant that matches the wind. The fish dry quicker, and for a month the house feels slightly luckier than its neighbors. She sings hushed lullabies with a scale that bends between notes. The melody turns into a habit for the baby, and then into a memory the man carries when he is too far from shore. None of this is visible to the law, but the law cannot hear what a house hears when doors are closed against weather. Myths arrive when memory gets bored and goes for a walk. Sagas prefer queens who throw goblets like punctuation, wives with keys heavy enough to anchor a ship, and shield maidens who argue with steel. Concubines turn up between stanzas, a whisper with timing, a glance that changes allegiance, a hand that steadies the cup before a decision. Poets exaggerate because listeners insist. If you must stay awake through winter, you want metaphors with antlers. Over centuries, the figure of the concubine gets polished into either temptation with elbow room or loyal, confidant with eyes that can find a needle in weather. Neither shape is entirely wrong. Neither lets the chores get a word in. When later storytellers pretend these women were always plotting or always pure, real houses shake their heads. Most days were not allegories. They were repetition practicing grace. In modern retellings, the concubine sometimes receives a sudden agency that looks suspiciously like a screenwriter's relief. It is tempting to give her a sword or a rescue that arrives right on cue because audiences like their epics fast. But the slower truth is a better sleeping partner. Agency usually meant a full larder when Snow had opinions, a word spoken at the right time to prevent a stupid fight, a baby soothed so a father could finish carving a prow and a voyage could start without a bad temper. Archaeology confirms the patient scale. In graves, brooch the size of modest hands hold together wool that survived as shadow. Beads of glass blue, green, occasionally the flirtatious red of a berry that belongs to summer sit at the collar where a woman decided to be a little beautiful, even when nobody had invented mirrors that could travel. Loom weights lie in longhouse floors in silent rows, saying, "Someone stood here and made kilometers of ordinary." The last business of the day is small but decisive. The household settles into its long exhale. A dog circles until it remembers the shape of sleeping. A log collapses into itself, sending up a spark that practices stars. The concubine counts the bowls without looking. She adjusts a sleeping child into a more honest coil, tucks in a stray ham so the night won't trip over it, and checks that the door bar is set against inconvenience. She might whisper a few words toward the rafters, not prayers exactly, but compliments for a roof that has done its arithmetic again. On a low shelf, a carved figure of a god or saint or both listens without comment. Even spirits know a stable fire beats a dramatic omen. If she shares the chieftain's bed, there may be talk or quiet. A confidence might be deposited like a coin where only she can find it later and spend it on peace. If she sleeps elsewhere, she folds herself into blankets that smell faintly of smoke and early mornings and agrees with the dark that everything important is currently happening very slowly. Before drifting, she arranges tomorrow in her mind like a row of pegs. Fetch water. Turn cheese. Recut the binding on the boy's boot. Ask the wife if the eel traps should be checked before rain. Phrase it as praise. Speak with the visitor about his nephew who drinks like a poem. Phrase it as worry. Add dried angelica to the stew for the old man's cough. Do not mention the angelica. Be where the conversation will drift when it needs a wall to lean on. None of this is the stuff of sagas. All of it is the frame on which sagas hang their colorful exaggerations. If someone one day carves a verse on stone and mentions her by title only, that will be enough. Titles are the words we use when the important part is obvious. Outside, the settlement says its goodnights in languages that don't require grammar. The well mutters about depth. The chickens who distrust philosophy consent to silence. Somewhere a man finishes a verse and decides not to sing it, which is the kindest thing he will do this week. The longhouse sleeps long, even if no one inside does. On the bench by the door, a folded cloak waits for tomorrow's weather, which will pretend to be new and will not be. The concubine's day has been a line of small hinge moments, each opening the next, none slamming. History remembers thunder on the sea and forgets the hand that kept the porridge from catching at the bottom of the pot. Tonight the hand rests. The pot cools without sulking. The house settles another millimeter into its foundation and becomes better at being a house. If you are still here, you may follow the quiet toward the rafters, where smoke once practiced departing and now the dark practices being kind. There is no conclusion to arrive at, only a sequence that knows its own path. The first pale line of morning, the ladle's scrape, the busy mercy of an ordinary day, asterisk.